what Kant is introducing here, what Kant is reflecting on, has more or less become a precept today, which is just to say that think for yourself, don't let others think for you. This seems so rudimentary to society now that it's almost like, well, what's novel about this? What's interesting? It's almost like a Reddit take, right? I could imagine a fedora tipping atheist say this. Think for yourself. Kant said that. And of course, then we get people like Bill Crystal quoting Kant as well in a very similar vein. So just thinking for yourself, this seems so basic. It has become a precept, and so maybe that's something we need to keep in mind going forward as well. What does it mean for this to just have become so fundamental? It's assumed in our education and everywhere. Um, Beyond that, I was also thinking of Smith again while I was reading this. For Smith, bourgeois society is really a logical historical outcome of something as rudimentary as the division of labor, which is basic to every form of society, be it the nuclear family, right? So if we imagine like hunter-gatherers, there was some form of division of labor already present at that earliest of stages. And then from that, through greater sophistication and reflection on this process, we're able to arrive at this highly differentiated society. And so in a very similar way, this is kind of natural. Bourgeois society is natural insofar as it evolves from the division of labor, and freedom of thought is kind of how humans develop naturally as well. This is to get at the necessity of it all and perhaps even the inevitability of it. There's a very clear progression from these earlier stages to now, be it if we're looking at thought or maybe the economic realm. So that's what was going through my mind. And other than that, Um, this might not be interesting. I might not be prepared to elaborate it sufficiently now, but I keep seeing people say, maybe it's become more popular now. It almost sounds like a boomerism, but people say that, human consciousness is the waking universe, the universe waking up to uh, reflect itself or to reflect on itself.
Yeah.
And this sounds, very grandiose to the point where you could imagine a boomer saying this and be like, "Oh wow, that's really gnarly." But we might say that the Enlightenment was waking society. Society actually being raised to the level of a subject, being able to reflect on itself. That this is what enlightenment is. It is society waking up to look back on itself. And one way in which this manifests is the political changes which take place during this time. Um, so again, I don't know if I could elaborate it more than that, but this might be an interesting way of beginning it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, before we, I guess, dive into I really want to get into the text because it's really short, but I think there's such a lot. Um, Maybe we could explain a little bit of like what we're doing.
People seem to agree that we live in the world that is a consequence of Enlightenment thought and early bourgeois society. Whether in actuality we can really say that this is the case, I think we more or less agree that it is.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's something that has to be demonstrated. Um, Perhaps,
We
but
we at least live in a world, I think, where the language of the Enlightenment is very called up, right? You can think about in some ways, if you think about how children are taught in school, and you think about the idea of when you take a world history class, there's always there's periods, there's ancient, and then there's medieval, and then there's kind of modern. But really, I look at it, there's a twofold division, right? There are the dark ages, right? And then there's like now. And the now starts at this period of enlightenment. And I think, whether this is an accurate description, like you say, it could be argued for. But certainly this is the narrative of our present state, which is we come from a world where the terms, or we live in the world where the terms of the Enlightenment are constantly being resurrected. And they're being resurrected, to invoke some kind of passion for reason, to invoke some kind of nostalgia, honestly. And so I guess I'll just kind of dive in here really quickly. But it's like we look at Kant, and many people think that the Enlightenment actually ends with Kant, right? Kant's death, I think in 1800 something, pretty early 1800s. People say the Enlightenment either ends in the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, or it ends with the death of Kant, which is kind of around the same period, and it starts maybe in sometime in the 1600s, you could say. And so this essay, What is Enlightenment, which we're obviously discussing today, is in 1784, which is 3 years after the first critique is published. But in many ways, I think it's interesting to view this essay as a retrospective on the Enlightenment. And I think it's interesting that Kant, obviously, there is a question that Kant thinks was worth addressing, namely, what is enlightenment, because of several problems that have arisen in enlightenment that I think he's going to address. But I guess the question for us is why read Kant? Why are we reading Kant? And I just, again, I'm called to this Hegel quote here, where he says, this is section 50 of the preface to the Phenomenology, where he says, the excellent not only cannot escape the fate of being deprived of life and spirit, of being flayed and then seeing its skin wrapped around a lifeless knowledge in its conceit. Rather, we recognize even in this fate the power that the excellent exercises over hearts, if not over the minds of men. So in some way, Hegel is noting that there's an immense power over the hearts that the Enlightenment seems to have hold of people nowadays. And that's what you point out with people like William Crystal. Why did they quote Kant, right? Why do they feel the need to do that? Certainly, maybe you could say it's a bit of profile building. They're trying to put on the profile of an intellectual, but in some way, the Enlightenment is a deeply romantic period in the modern world. There's a lot of nostalgia. The writings of the Enlightenment have primarily sentimental value. And that is precisely what Hegel's warning us about 200 years ago, which is, hey, these kinds of period, the Enlightenment, it's a serious period in history. It means something. But when today we look at it, we risk the temptation of the content of the Enlightenment being flayed, right? And wrapped around something meaningless. So what we need to be concerned is what Hegel says is the concern of the mind, which is, when it's truth. So when we're inquiring into Kant, I think we're not attempting to rediscover the Enlightenment, as maybe many people are today, but trying to concern ourselves of what is true about the Enlightenment, and also making sense of, in view of what happened in the Enlightenment, what's happening now. Certainly, it's a nostalgic process when we read Kant talking about living in an age of enlightenment. It can certainly feel like we're living in an age of disenlightenment now, in some sense. So it might be tempting to dip into nostalgia. And I think the biggest thing when we're reading Kant here that I think we need, that anybody who is doing this ought to be concerned with, is to not fall into the temptation, the ultimate temptation of doing political history, which is we're only just concerned with, was this good or bad, right? That is, I think, the error of like the modern academy, right? So if you take a political theory course, you're going to be viewing a wide variety of different thinkers. And really the only concern, I think, in a lot of, maybe you could say, ideological programs is, well, was this good for democracy, right? How were these thinkers good for us now, whether they were good or whether they were bad, right? When you read Machiavelli in, a political theory, it's like they talk about the influence they has, but also, right, his kind of cynicism in this regard, whether he's good for democracy. And so we want to avoid this when we look at Kant. And like you say, the big thing we can do is we can look at problem. And so I think the insights that we get into this, the problems that I looked at here that seem to be he's trying to take account of, which is one of them is, what's the relationship of the Enlightenment to its institutions? of the time. Kant talks about in this essay predominantly the institution of religion, but he also talks about its relationship with the state, even its relationship with the sciences. Um, if the Enlightenment is free thinking, which we'll get into when he says, then what's its relationship with institutions that exert a kind of dogmatic control over people, of which the state's included, right? We need to obey the state's laws. How, if the Enlightenment is telling us to think freely, there's a tension. So that's a problem. And then I also thought, you know, how does the Enlightenment refrain from cannibalizing these authorities? That seems to be a concern that Kant has, which is he goes to great pains to talk about how the Enlightenment is not about undermining authority. He actually has, maybe we could say, a touch of bourgeois cynicism when he talks about the necessity of authority. But, why is the Enlightenment, the free thinking movement, not, eating the institutions that make it possible? So those are some of the questions that I thought or some of the problems that I thought could be addressed. So
I don't know if it's nostalgia, but like I said earlier, these precepts such as humans should think for themselves have become so ubiquitous that I don't know if it'd be right to say that they've lost all meaning. I think certainly in a sense, I at least am trying to rediscover perhaps a deeper meaning to these things. Um, so, but I agree with you. We're not just trying to trace out a history. We're not trying to sort out all the different biographical details of this period. We are trying to discover, maybe rediscover, the truth content of it.
yeah.
But yeah,
When I say rediscover in the sense of, I mean in the sense that it seems weaponized now. The Enlightenment seems highly weaponized, right? That we look on it with a degree of, and it does, to say like, hey, man, it's like, you can read part of this in Kant and say like, wow, what a very heady time Kant is writing at, right? Where these kind of questions are being asked, and now I think people are, cite Kant or even Rousseau or these other figures in a romantic sense of trying to recall kind of the ghost of the spirit of the Enlightenment. And, like it or not, we're no longer there, obviously, is a matter of kind of truism. But it's like, but nor can we fall into I think, the pitfall of trying to overly, oh, look at, this is, we need to we need to accept what Kant has to say as like a model for what we need to do now. We need to, like Kant says, we need to think freely. And that's what you're saying. Is like, it seems hollow when the Redditors tell us to think, just precisely because it's like, well, we don't live in this age, right? So, trying to resurrect its spirit for us now seems like a rather cliched enterprise. But,
no, I precisely. It is, in other words, this could not be written today. It
no,
would
yeah,
not be
exactly,
enough
exactly.
to write today. Everybody just think for yourself. Um, so why is that the case? Why is it perhaps not enough? What could be said in lieu of that today?
Yeah.
If just sapere aude is insufficient. But yeah, great. No, I think that's brilliant.
All right. So I guess the kind of first section of my outline here was there's this quote. It's just the beginning. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity, and I thought it was interesting that he throughout this is going to recall theme, and this is where he's introducing. He's going to recall the idea of like a maturity, right? That there's a enlightenment is a kind of growth, but at the same time, and he goes down. He says the immaturity is self-incurred, right? That like he seems to imply that well, mankind is actually already matured in a sort of natural state, but its immaturity has come about through its own restriction of itself. So at one point, right, it's like we have this sense of society is in its infancy, but it doesn't have to be. It's like it's in its infancy, but not not as a matter of its conditions. He has this phrase. I don't. It's like the French phrase. I wouldn't even try to pronounce it, but it means coming to age. Coming to age by virtue of nature, where he has this idea that, well, in the natural process of things, society's already come to age. We've come to be able to think. And he says nature has long emancipated us from alien guidance. And I take this alien guidance to just mean kind of natural conditions to restrain mankind, right? We've kind of reached beyond the point of caveman as a, caveman society where, well, okay, we can actually, we have a surplus. We can sit down, we can think critically. So yeah, but yeah, what's your making of this analogy of immaturity?
Um, as I was reading this, I referred to some other sources as well, and immaturity is not the only word that's used for that. Some other common uses were minority and non-age, which is something I'd never heard of before. Um, the first time we discussed this text, if you remember, I put a big premium in my thoughts on this analogy of age. And then I thought, okay, so um, maybe what's happening is society is going through some kind of growing pains. That, again, to stick with the analogy of maturing and growing, that there are these kind of growing pains that society has to go through. Um, so maybe that is what is self-imposed, kind of the self-imposed restrictions are part of that growing pain. Um, but I think you nipped that in the bud pretty quickly. So I don't know. I don't know. It's a question of, so if we've already attained to maturity, what where did the restrictions then come from? It would seem to suggest, and I think he says it later on, that the uh, the restrictions, kind of civil institutions, which in some way restrict civil freedom, are very much part of the process of becoming mature. Um, he says that he talks about this at the very end when he's referring to civil freedom and freedom of spirit.
Yeah.
So for now, it's I'll just leave it up in the air, and as we proceed in the essay, we'll hopefully get to it. But where did these restrictions come from if we're already mature? Is it just a matter of returning to a state of nature? Or maybe in like Rousseau's sense, um, attaining to something that is like a state of nature, that is more natural. And I think Kant would probably agree with that. But that is not just like a return to caveman existence.
Yeah.
Um, I think Rousseau has this idea of like the peasants under the tree and kind of this blissful existence of having our needs cared for and just kind of sitting in the shade of an oak tree or something like that, like peasants would. That this would be more natural and more akin to a higher state of nature. So yeah, there's this notion that there's like a primitive state of nature and then a higher state of nature. I don't know if we'll get that from Kant, but I think that's certainly one of the ideas that's floating around here.
Yeah. Well, this goes well to my kind of the next point that I had, which is I asked the question like who are the guardians? So he talks about that there are various people who have set themselves up as society's guardians. And I noted that the word for this in German, I think it was Vormunden, which is the plural of Vormund. And Vormund refers to specifically like the guardian of a child. I think if I'm right there, right? Yeah, it's and so in some way he's these guardians, right? He's invoking already the idea of society as kind of childish in some way, right? And I think as we go on this next page, he's going to talk about how in some way this is necessary. But I thought it was interesting. because he trades on this concept of a guardian several times. He seems in this paragraph, he seems to think of it as a kind of negative thing, but later he's going to talk about how it's actually not necessarily a negative thing. So I thought it's interesting to notice this idea of the Vormund and the people who are the guardians. But I think at first I was just kind of struck by, all right, well, Kant's talking about authorities here, right? He invokes, says, if I have a book to have understanding in place of me, a spiritual advisor to have a conscience for me, a doctor to judge my diet for me, and so on, I need not make any efforts at all. And so these are the kind of guardians that are calling to mind. And I noted that I think Kant is addressing this in two ways. So I think in one way, I think it's a bit of an authority thing, right? It just is institutional authority, right? That we have these various figures in life who we vest with authority on account of expertise or some kind of training, and there's a tension just endemic to authority that some way removes volition or removes self-determination, right? And even though this can be a good thing in the case of a doctor, right? He's like, a doctor might actually provide you with a really good diet. But Kant seems to know, well, at the same time, right, if he does it for you, there's a lack of self-determination involved. And so I thought about, and then the second thing I thought about along the lines of determination was this danger of dogmatism. That, right? So on one hand, I don't think Kant means to point out that authority itself is bad. I think that'd be a really cliched reading of it. But I think in a deeper sense, he's talking about dogmatism, where he talks about, he says, dogmas and formulas, those mechanical instruments for rational use or rather misuse of his natural endowments, are the ball and chain of his permanent immaturity. And this recalled something to me from Hegel. And I don't think Kant is making the same point as Hegel, because I don't think it's really hit in Kant's time quite yet. But it's the idea that he talks about formulas and dogma as bondage. And I thought of an analogy that maybe we can tie in with the idea of have your own understanding. What does it mean to use your own understanding? And so if you think about it, in a math textbook, you might have like a formula, right? You might be able to see like a proof or something like this. You frequently encounter this in textbooks, like they'll list out a proof. And so what is conveyed to you via this proof is some axiom or truth of mathematics, right? It's proof to you. And you, the reader, as you look at this, you are immediately confronted with, okay, this is the truth, right? This is what is true. Someone has proved this. But what you are not conveyed with is the fact that some person had to prove this. Namely, some person had to do the mental labor involved to discover and to make this proof. That's something you cannot get when you are reading it from the textbook. And in a way, it's a way that society is formulatized and dogmatized, where we take knowledge, we take the content of knowledge of something like mathematics, we throw into a textbook because we tell people, you don't need to be right. Hey, on one hand, there's a practical use. We don't, if someone has proved it, then we don't need to sit here and constantly learn from scratch. But at the same time, I think Kant, in a sense, gets to the idea that, well, if you have these proofs, there's no need for you to further understand. You just simply know, well, the proof is good or it isn't. And you aren't confronted with the understanding that was required by the person actually making the proof. And in that way, even if you're just writing the proof to yourself, you're not fully taking in the understanding, because all your understanding is, well, this is proving something true or this is proving something false. And in that sense, you're not recognizing, if it's false, you're not recognizing it as what Hegel would say, a moment of the truth. And if it's true, you just sort of take it for granted. It's just an assumption. And in that sense, it's constraining you, right? It's preventing you from understanding like a deeper content, in this case of mathematics. That's something I think is not quite, Hegel makes this critique of mathematics specifically, But for Kant, it seems like he's going to make this critique of religion specifically. But I think that was this kind of way of a textbook of understanding of the Enlightenment, right? In some way turns on itself because people are immediately confronted with a wealth of knowledge, right? Even in philosophy, you have scholastic manuals, which are just cardinals. You can look it up even now, right? The Catholic Church just has manuals of scholastic philosophy, in which the proofs of Thomas Aquinas and these other people are just made ready to you in front of you. And you learn the manual and you recite it, and Aquinas or whoever. But I think Kant would say, no, you're not really using your own understanding there. In a deeper sense, then it's not you who's just doing it, but you're not understanding these proofs in their place in the movement of truth and everything like that. So I know that was long, but that was one of my immediate thoughts when I look at this kind of section here of guardians and dogmatism.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. I think you're right. I think you're right. In very much the same vein, right? This is playing out in society, or it had been playing out in society, which is to say that, the corollary of the formula in the textbook here is something like the great chain of being, that in society what was true was what was already given. And so that meant first and foremost simply reconstituting the same existence generation after generation, without the insight that someone had to first constitute this existence. Someone had to
Right.
first arrange it, and that the division of labor had to sort itself in this peculiar way. And so this tracks within. So if the insight here is that, you know, opening the treasure trove of possible knowledge in society, there is this realization that human beings have always themselves constituted their mode of existence. And if we recognize this, we might be able to constitute it differently or more rationally. And how this manifests is just a treasure trove of possibilities. You're no longer bound to simply the truth that was handed down to you in the form of your vocation, but it is actually up to you to discover your own vocation. And this is taking place all across society. So I think there's definitely a synchronicity here in what is happening, and it's unbelievably fascinating.
I want to also, I think it'd be remiss if we didn't, when we're talking about the Guardians, there are political implications to this, right? The groups he mentions, there are definitely, he specifically talks about um, the Guardians, right? It's like domesticating animals. They need to be docile creatures. And he says it's threatening to the guardians of the institutions for people to think with their own understanding.
Sure. You've already said it. There's a kind of surface level libertarian reading that
Yeah.
one could take away here, which is just that authority is bad. Um, he doesn't seem to think that. Um, Later on in this essay, he kind of lifts up and praises the prince who allows his subjects to think freely. Um, and you almost get the impression that what he's recapitulating here is something like Plato's philosopher king. Perhaps that is a similar kind of superficial reading that one could take away from here, is that,
Yeah.
if the guardians themselves are simply enlightened, well, then there's no issue.
Yeah,
Problem is that.
well, I want to talk about that specific, but there, he mentions Frederick and
Mhm.
like Frederick the Great, and I'm pretty sure like the moniker of Frederick the Great is the enlightened monarch or something like this. Or like the enlightened king, German king or something like this. So
There's an identification he makes between the Age of Enlightenment
in
and
the
the
age of Frederick.
Century of Frederick.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely some wordplay going on there, right? Frederick is enlightened. We live in the age of enlightenment.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe we can when we get to that part, we can, but so in terms of if we want to talk about maybe in terms of ideology or something like this, I think there's this section here where he says, well, nowadays, there's the chance of the public enlightening itself. And he talks about, well, what's the method of public enlightenment? And he makes this very remarkably cynical idea that really the only way for the public to be enlightened is if the guardians themselves, the people who are presumably in control of the institutions, the authorities of society, are themselves enlightened. And it's a trickle-down effect, that there is not a bottom-up enlightenment. But that was just like what I seem to identify. I thought it was actually kind of cynical, but did you have a different reading of that there?
This language of guardianship would suggest that in its infancy, humanity is entrusted to enlightened guardians, or guardians who have become guardians by virtue of being enlightened. And again, I guess this would be much closer to Plato's philosopher kings, that it's the philosophers who exercise this custodianship over society, who raise society up. And then in time, um, the need for this kind of guardianship falls off as the public becomes enlightened. So maybe this is what Kant is saying. So maybe he is almost, making Plato's argument here, the argument from the Republic.
Well, I don't know this. So here was my next thing where I'm going to compare this I'll read this, but I'm going to compare it to what Marx says. Um, so he says the remarkable thing about this public enlightenment is that if the public, which was previously put under the yoke by the guardians, is suitably stirred up by some of the latter who are incapable of enlightenment, it may subsequently compel the guardians themselves to remain under the yoke. For it is very harmful to propagate prejudices because they finally avenge themselves on the very people who first encouraged them. Thus, a public can only achieve enlightenment slowly. And I was super intrigued by this because this is directly followed by a line where he says, a revolution may well put an end to autocratic despotism or power-seeking oppression, but it will never produce a true reform in ways of thinking. And I asked myself, why is this the case? Why is this so? It's just, I found it interesting that he labeled a specific class of people who he says who are members of the public who are incapable of enlightenment. And so I was saying, well, if enlightenment is identified with freedom, or the want for freedom or the want for free thinking, then the people that are incapable of enlightenment, what would one have to do to be incapable of enlightenment? Either you have to be incapable of free thought, which it seems like Kant says pretty much anybody, is capable of kind of free thought, or you altogether reject the notion that this is possible, that freedom is like a realizable end, which I think you might identify in some way if, with a kind of Bonapartist ideology, right? Where there's a certain cynicism in regards to, right, for the Bonapartists, they follow the kind of liberal monarchy regime. And the Bonapartists, they're not the liberal monarchists, but nor are they the aristocracy. And I think that's true because he says here they're members of the public, right? So they're not the guardians, which would presumably include aristocrats. And if they're not the guardians and they're members of the public, then they're the kinds of people that support the Bonapartists. They're the kind of proto-fascists in a way, where there is a group of people in the public who just reject the idea that there can be freedom, and they're capable of stirring up the public to prevent the progress of freedom, which is which is I think exactly what Marx would say something like a Bonaparte is, right? It's people were stirred up, right? Louis Bonaparte is elected. He's elected president. It represents a complete defeat. His coup is just the continuation of the people who elected him. And it is a stop in freedom, right? It's a pause, just as Napoleon, the original Napoleon, is is a stop in freedom where the French Revolution is. And it's propagated by precisely this class of people who are cynical of the prospect of an enlightenment or a freedom, right? The Napoleon supporters are the people who are cynical of the revolution in France, right? Who are cynical of the Jacobins, who are cynical of the Enlightenment, etc. And they rally around a guy like Napoleon, who's a popular figure. And so in some way, it's kind of public being stirred up by these people to support someone who wants to return the yoke of immaturity. That's kind of the angle I was going at there. And I recognize this is just purely kind of conjecture, a kind of sociological conjecture. And I'm not expecting Kant to actually say this, but there's something there of the idea of people who are incapable of enlightenment, but are subsequently capable of putting a cap on enlightenment, like you say.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's there in the text. Um, in the same paragraph, or maybe not in the same paragraph as this. Uh, no, it is in the same paragraph. He starts it off by saying that a public should enlighten itself is more possible. Indeed, this is almost inevitable, if only it is left its freedom. Um, so again, he's still saying that, um, kind of the basic condition of possibility for enlightenment is just freedom, and that this freedom is the natural condition, which can only but be restricted unnaturally. So, is he saying then that there's this unnatural current in society? Well, sure. I think there's plenty of things that he would say that are perhaps unnatural. Um, Certainly, some of our institutions, right? These are not necessarily natural, and they are self-imposed. So there's these unnatural currents. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if he's just dispensing with the possibility of the whole public becoming enlightened. I don't think he believes that. But he does say at the end of the paragraph, new prejudices will serve just as well as old ones to harness the great unthinking masses, which is what you've been talking about.
Right.
Um,
That rings very much it's very fascistic in some sense, right? The new prejudices, um, they replace old ones and they control the unthinking masses. I don't know. So
so,
in the span of in Kant as a liberal thinker,
mhm,
there's already an element of preempting illiberalism.
sure. Maybe one way to think about it is that new prejudices are always constituting themselves. They're always appearing. Could be old prejudices that reappeared, entirely new ones. Um, which is just to say that again, as Kant himself says of his own time, he's not living in an enlightened age, but he is living in an age of enlightenment. So the prejudices which harness the unthinking masses, as well as the freedom to think, these are two moments in one process, and this process is ongoing. What would it mean for there to be no prejudices that could possibly harness the unthinking masses? Would we then have arrived in an enlightened age? Would that mean that we've overcome or ended the process of enlightenment? Or is it not the case that enlightenment is something that is open-ended and constantly happening, which would suggest that there's always the possibility of disenlightenment. So there's maybe a kind of frightening ambiguity about that.
So I think this next paragraph where he talks about, what's the famous line of the officer says, "Don't argue," the taxpayer says, "Don't argue, pay," etc. Um, Really, the main thing, the main thesis here is that um, enlightenment requires freedom, specifically freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. And I thought that I think there were kind of two motivators. This really encompasses the next, several paragraphs of this where he's going to elaborate this, but I thought I could make a couple divisions where it seems to me that he talks about there's, in terms of political, the use of reason free politically, actual mechanisms, right? Like the state that physically prevent people from voicing opinions. And then also with respect to people's moral conscience, you need to be free to object to kind of things. That's where he gets in his comments about religion. And I think the big way that this dichotomy is presented is in another division of public and private reason. So I had some thoughts on this, but I want to, what was your make of the public private reason distinction?
Yeah. I think well, we talked about this in the very beginning. I don't know if the recording caught it, but it seemed like you and I had different readings of the distinction of public and private reason. To me, public reason means society being able to reflect upon itself. It is thinking society, society engaged in self-critique, and it's, Kant is part of that critique. So this essay that Kant is writing, it's society critiquing itself. Um, this is to me what public reason means, and maybe it conjures up an image of like a public forum where different people are laying their opinions, the free press or what have you. That there are these different mediums that could take, but really what it is it's society raised to a level of self-consciousness and reflecting on itself and maybe even steering itself in a certain sense. Versus private reason. Private reason is the reason which we exercise in kind of our function in society.
Yeah.
And so if I could, I don't know, I've been reading a little bit of Durkheim recently. So when I was reading this, I thought of his distinction between mechanical and organic solidarity, and a society in which organic solidarity is preponderant. People are not as segmented as maybe more primitive societies. Everyone is filling a function which is dependent upon and interconnected in a certain sense with every other function, which is simply to say sophisticated division of labor, division of tasks in the whole society, and that the whole society is this, it's analogous to an organism in that sense. So the private reason is part of the function that we play in this organism. But in the same vein, we are also we are also capable of exercising public reason, which is what regulates the whole organism. So we are a part of the organism, but we are also its nervous system. I mean, we are its nervous system. We are also the brain in a certain sense. We are what regulates and legislates the organism. So that's kind of what was going through my mind when I was reading this. Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know. Is that clear?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head with private reason. Kant gives the idea that someone exercises his private reason, or he gives an example of like a teacher, right? When you're in the presence of your congregation or your students, you're in a role, and that's the private use of your reason. And likewise, a clergyman with his congregation is going to exercise private reason by teaching them. One of the things that I thought was interesting to note about private reason, which was it is incumbent upon someone to use. It seems like Kant says it's incumbent upon someone to use their private reasoning faculties in a specific way. He said, right, for example, he says, quote, a clergyman is bound to instruct his pupils and his congregation in accordance with the doctrines of the church he serves, for he was employed by it on that condition. And so in some way, the idea of if we think of public reason as free, we might think of private reason as somewhat restrained. And I thought it was oddly unrevolutionary that Kant seems to think that there is a moral obligation on the part of someone in the use of private reason to use it how this role wants you to. So, my example, it's really easy to see this with like a school teacher. Kant seems to say when you're acting with your private reason as a school teacher, you have a moral obligation to teach in accordance with whatever contract you have, i.e., what the now for us what the state tells you to, right? And in modern society, it's a big deal of teachers might find curriculum objectionable on either side of it doesn't go far enough or it goes too far. And so I think Kant does make a thing of if you think that there's a if the clergyman thought he could find anything of this sort in them, this sort meaning some content that's absolutely opposed to truth, he would not be able to carry out his duties in good conscience and he would have to resign. So I think he allows the idea that if there is something that is totally against that would prevent you from performing this duty in good conscience, then you should resign. But at the same time, there is an element of, hey, you have a role to play. You have an obligation to play this role. And, if we think about kind of extrapolating this now, this, like I say, seems very unrevolutionary, or, very, very restrictive that, we would think that a teacher in our society has some liberty over this kind of thing. But Kant says no, because in the use of private reason, we already get the idea that private reason has a restriction to it. That when you are acting in a job for the state, and he gives an example of a police officer. When you're a police officer, you are not free to question orders, and you may be punished for questioning orders. Now you can criticize these orders as a member, right? As like a learned man or something
A
like this.
scholar,
Yeah, the
yeah.
scholar. He says that over and over again. But you can't do this in your capacity. So already there's I noted going into this that there's a distinction, which we might say is distinctly bourgeois, of the private life and the public life, right? That in a private life, you got to do your job, right? I know that's definitely a big thing that you hear that and to use your phrase, like a boomerism, right? Well, when you're doing your job, you better do what they say, but we can't persecute people for what they say outside their job, right? Is what we say, maybe that is endemic of what cancel culture is, right? Criticizing people's public life. But here, it seems right here, Kant painfully acknowledges the distinction of public life and private life. And I in on one hand, there's a tension to this. You're morally obligated to make free use of your reason in public life, for the sake of human progress, which he talks about later. We can talk about that. But also you have to submit yourself to society's laws, um, even to the point of unquestionably, right? In his thing, he says, if you refuse to pay taxes because you think the taxes are unjust, you should be punished. Even if you think that there are arguments for why these taxes are unjust. And he says, but you're free to critique what the taxes are being used for. And that example was highly interesting to me because that precludes all libertarians in our modern day, right? So it's like, on one hand, there's the idea that for Kant, for people like Kant, the state, participation in the state is antecedent to any sort of moral activity. So there's that. But at the same time, there's a dimension of public life where you're absolutely free to say what you want. But insofar as you're a member of the state, you're not free. So I thought that's an interesting when we talk about Kant as a liberal thinker. Um, Even if Kant's the end of the Enlightenment, then what does this say, right? What do we get here when we have the distinction of private and public life?
Okay. No. Again, great exposition of that. A couple of thoughts. Um, so the way that this becomes ubiquitous today is as civic duty, right? That you have a civic duty to pay your taxes. You can criticize the system. You can elect a representative to, uh, I guess, make your suggestions as to how the tax code should be amended or whatever, right? But once it's payday, right? Once it's time, once the tax man comes by to collect, you have a civic duty to pay. So
Yeah.
you're right. This is a boomerism. It's the boomer attitude. It seems, again, to maybe borrow Marx's phrasing from the 18th Brumaire, it seems very unheroic for a revolutionary agenda, to pay your taxes. um, Another interesting thought, you raising cancel culture. Cancel culture is in effect then the opposite of what Kant is talking about here. It's the non-distinction of public and private reason. And so it's the ultimate betrayal of bourgeois right. It's the betrayal of your right to exercise your public reason while retaining your private life, right? The separation of spheres. Um, Cancel culture just cuts right through that.
Yeah, there's like a
Uh,
monistic, right? That there is only one sphere, right?
yeah,
Um,
exactly. There's
and
only
they use that kind
one
of
reason.
language too, right? Like I hear people all the time who are like, well, your job, you and your job and you and your life are, you're not separate or whatever. So
Hmm.
I think there's a one of the things I brought up, and this was not while I was recording, but like, why does he make this distinction? Where does this come from? Because it's absolutely, I don't think it's not just out of the blue. I think it goes back to Kant's idea of the transcendental ego, where in the critique of perception, that is Kant's philosophy, or at least his philosophy within the critique of pure reason. You have to have a perceiver in some sense, right? But the perceiver, the reason why it's the transcendental ego is that it must absolutely synthesize all of your perceptions and unify them according to the categories of understanding. So in that way, it's transcendent because it's required in order for the possibility of you having a unified perception. And so I relate this in some senses, like you have the transcendental ego, which is absolutely you, right? But at the same time, the transcendental ego must posit the categories of understanding in order to even to perform its function to unify perception. And so I thought about it in that sense, where maybe that allows us to kind of have a reason of, well, how can you even make this distinction? Why do we need a public reason and private reason? And maybe we can say the argument for this comes from the idea of a transcendental ego, right? Where it's, if we map this on to this kind of syllogism onto society, it's like, well, society requires, right, the progress of mankind as species requires his ability to critically think, to learn. And that, I think, is what he goes on to describe. That's the process of enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
Is to criticize. And but the very notion of the possibility for this criticism relies on things that make it intelligible, which are the structures of society, right? The structures of society that we must maintain in order to engage in the kind of critical free thinking that Kant thinks. And he has this line at the end, which I hope we can discuss, where he identifies what he says as was it a paradox, where he says a high degree of civil freedom seems advantageous to a people's intellectual freedom, yet it also sets up insuperable barriers to it. Conversely, a lesser degree of civil freedom gives intellectual freedom enough room to expand to its fullest extent. And so I'd like to talk about that later. I'd like to prefigure it at least now when we're talking about, well, just as perception requires both the transcendental ego and the categories of understanding which allow the ego to perform its function. so does the exercise of of both private and public reason. There's an interlocking relationship there. Society's progress depends on the ability of people to learn to think critically, and this thinking critically ability at one time presupposes the notion that, well, we must have structures to make this intelligible, to make free thinking possible. And maybe it calls back Aristotle in book one of the Politics when he says the state is prior to man, in the sense that the functions of man are only made sense, not just that man needs the state, but the functions of man are only even intelligible in the state itself. And I think we might say, in this sense, Kant is, I think, to make this public and private reason thing, he's borrowing on this distinction in Aristotle and that which exists in his own transcendental philosophy, just so that it's, one might be tempted to say, right, if we took the view of cancel culture, why do we need to make this distinction? Why is this necessary? Right? What's the point? And I think the point is that he picks up on something that Aristotle also picked up on, and something that's also necessary to his own philosophy. Just as the individual needs these kind of two interlocking relationships between his transcendent ego and the categories that make his perception intelligible, society really needs both of these things too. But there's a tension there, right? That perhaps we could say that the wokest movement picks up on, and it's easier to let one win, right? To let one of these facets win rather than to kind of try to explore their interconnection and their mediation of each other. So you could say, I think your idea that the cancel culture is the betrayal of this. Yeah, it's the betrayal because it's the easy way out, right? It's just letting one triumph over the other without recognizing a real needed relationship there. But those are
Definitely am.
I think there's a lot going on there in that section of public and private reason.
I think you've given a very unified presentation of that. It makes sense. So, the fragmentation of something like the state, the public realm, would amount to the loss of these fundamental categories of intelligibility, or perhaps we might say the loss of those institutions that mediate intelligibility.
Oh, I think the third thing, the next discernible section is what I just kind of called like the critique of religion, I guess, or the critique of religion in Kant's time. So what's your make of his kind of treatment of religious dogma and his argument against like infallible dogma?
Yeah. Um, I didn't read it as a critique of religion as much as a critique of, well, Catholicism, kind of institutional stagnation.
Right.
Um, Maybe this is kind of out of left field in a certain sense, but um, his view of religion might be more revelatory in the sense that he wants religious institutions to be amenable to reflection, and thus perhaps in a certain sense, uh, like, I don't know, revelatory in the realm of tradition, right? Since someone like Kant and the Protestants would not admit of very drastic changes, um, religious changes, theological changes. Perhaps, you know, I'm sure there are people who disagree with that, but um, what is changing are the traditions, um, and so perhaps uh, Kant sees the development of religious tradition as an open-ended process that is enlightenment. Um, does that comport to a Christian understanding of the world? Um, does that comport to traditional Christian ecclesiology or something like this? Um, I guess it depends, right? But I don't, it seems to be more of a critique of Catholicism than it is of religious thought, spiritual thought.
Yeah, I definitely it rang as Catholic, especially, with the idea that in Catholicism you actually have things that are dogma, which are regarded as infallible, universal
Yeah.
truths of the church. But I mention it because he says his example is an ecclesiastical synod or a venerable presbytery, as the Dutch call it. Um, and really, there was like a kind of argument. Um, some of this reflects his remarks in his essay "Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason," where he kind of criticizes hierarchy as well, and just generally the need of reason to, or of religion to be able to be capable of rationally reflecting on itself, which I suppose these dogmas would do. But nevertheless, there were some interesting arguments. He talks about, okay, he asks this question: for the sake of, religious guidance, can an institution commit itself to infallible doctrines which stand for all time? And he says no. He says no, I think, on two accounts. Um, and on the one is that he says it's preventing all further enlightenment. So it's contrary to the principle of enlightenment, which is where I think we can now, it's proper to engage with um, a notion of, or maybe what you would call a strand of utopianism in this view of enlightenment that we've really kind of hinted on or teased, I think, probably in all of our comments on this. But here he says, right, the idea of a church committing itself to doctrine, um, it would prevent all further enlightenment. He says precisely this would be a crime against human nature, whose original destiny lies in precisely such progress. Ooh. So obviously there's utopianism here, right? In a, we could say on some level there's utopianism. Um, but I also thought that this notion of progress, right, in a sense, to do Kant justice, um, perhaps a person who is not sympathetic to the liberal ideal would look at this and say, well, look, this is just proof that the liberal project has been constantly utopian. And there's a temptation to do this, which is the idea of, look, Kant literally says it right here. Humanity is just a story of progress. That's what it should be, and we can't get in the way of such progress, right? Which maybe you could say is the essence of utopian thought. And I think my rejoinder to this, um, because I don't think that's all of what Kant's saying. And so my rejoinder to this would be, all right, well, what's the business of, right, if humanity is progress and progress is enlightenment, what precisely is the business of enlightenment, is I think the appropriate question. And I would just say that I think Kant, means the idea that the business of enlightenment is critical. And he says, I think my support is this. He says, one age cannot enter into an alliance on oath to put the next age at a position where it would be impossible for it to extend and correct its knowledge, particularly on such important matters. So I think at the same time, there's an idea of, well, the Enlightenment is being able to revise your knowledge, being able to be critical. And so Kant is saying, can we really even commit ourselves to be so uncritical, even if it is about religion? And I think my example of this was the idea of, all right, well, what's being critical? My English teacher, every day we were in junior year of high school, think critically. What does that mean? And everyone says think critically. That's another boomerism. You need to think critically. What does that mean? Well, for Kant, critique and for the idealists in general, critique is just it's a faculty of a kind of judgment, of criticizing not only what is immediately clear to you, your perception, but also the way in which you perceive it, right? Being able to be aware of the kind of principles by which you filter your reality. And so my example was people who move out of their parents' home, When they live on their own, they might run a household very similar to the way their parents run a household. And this general principle is, well, my parents generally know, my parents are correct on how to run a household. And this is a very common thing. And so your experience within a household is solely filtered through this principle of, well, why am I doing something? Well, I'm doing it because my parents did it, right? And this is how my parents did it, and my parents are correct about it. So that's why I do it. This is in some way a kind of uncritical position, right? And to be critical means simply to just question whether your parents were always correct in how they run their household. And so, really, I think what Kant would say is that doing so, right, that's why he says correcting knowledge, it can actually make your life better. Maybe your parents were inefficient. Maybe your mom always ran the dishwasher 4 times before actually putting the dishes back up. And we might reflect and say, well, mom, that's a terribly inefficient way of cleaning the dishes, right? 4 times, that's wasting so much water. But in so doing, you're not just presenting, well, I want to do things differently. You're engaging in a kind of critical process where you're accepting the idea that, well, your parents aren't the ultimate authority on how to run a household. They might be wrong, right? And so you revise that principle and you live in a different way, in a better way. And so, in the same way, I would think Kant would say, um, well, look, right? We're not necessarily talking about progress in the sense of there's a utopian ideal that we are constantly going for. Progress means our revising the body of knowledge, right? That the body of knowledge that we have, the principles by which we are living, are constantly subject to the critical process. And that's enlightenment. So that's my take on the charge that you might levy of Kant of being a utopian. Maybe you could say there's an element of this to it, the idea of progress. Because he does say there's a cringeworthy line where he says that, I think it's on the next page, right? A person who renounces enlightenment is trampling underfoot the sacred rights of mankind. And I confess I did cringe to this because
That's
enlightenment,
very Reddit.
the sacred right. You're infringing on my sacred rights. But nonetheless, for the benefit of the doubt, and just it appears to be what Kant really wants to say is, I think, well, the business of the Enlightenment is being able to revise our body of knowledge. So just as we can't commit ourselves now to make a law where we say it's impossible to revise our body of knowledge, nor could we do this in the future. So that was, I think, like one of the arguments there. But what's your take on the on a kind of utopian strain that you really find throughout this work?
So if the utopian strain is just progress, I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily utopian. Perhaps it would be to say that we will only progress, that the future will necessarily always be better off than the past. Perhaps that would be a certain kind of utopianism. It might lend itself to utopianism. I think you're basically right that Kant is saying the the past is not afforded a lease on the future. Um, right? The past really has nothing to say about the future, right? As a matter of fact, right? Because we do not, we don't know what the future will be like. But the relationship that the present has to the past is very different. We very much get to, as you say, revise our body of knowledge. We very much get to cast judgment on the past. Um, the past is not afforded the right nor the ability um, to that kind of relationship with the future. Again, the past might try, right? We might try today to um, carve in stone what we believe to be, or what we have agreed to be dogmatic about, right? We might try to carve in stone our dogmas, um, but we really have nothing, no way of guaranteeing or nothing to say about how those uh, dogmas carved in stone will be received in the future. So, I mean, I don't know. It does almost seem very basic. it seems like a very basic take. Um, as you say, it almost boomerish Reddit.
Yeah.
Um,
But,
but I think it's true. I mean,
yeah,
it's basically what could be held against it. Um, we might certainly for a long time, if we take this view of the past as, of traditional society as being set in the parameters of a chain of being, it certainly seems like for a long time people lived their lives according to this kind of relationship of the past to the future, where you simply do um, reproduce the same mode of existence and you simply pass on past dogmas to future generation. And so there's no change. But of course, this is not an entirely accurate view. Um, Even in what we now call the Dark Ages, there were changes. Scholasticism is a school of thought, and it was certainly stagnant in some respects. I think we can agree to that. It did go through certain changes. It developed in certain sense. Um, but for all intents and purposes, um, the past does not have this kind of power that it might want over the future. Um, and that's, I guess, just
yeah,
I don't know what else to say about it other than it seems to be self-evident. I don't know.
yeah. One thing I was,
Maybe that's just lazy, but um, the Redditors can be right sometimes as well.
well, okay, well, one thing that I was noted that I was reminded of in his argument against this, which is, well, we can't, how are we to say that future generations, how are we to deprive them of the idea of thinking critically or to revise the body of knowledge? And I think a big thing would be I'm reminded of this passage in a book Behind the Mirror by an Austrian thinker, Konrad Lorenz, where he says, in some sense, nature, right, animals and plants, they don't learn from failure. They only learn from success. It is the way of nature to learn from success because evolution rewards that which survives. So failure in kind of nature, if you fail, you die, right? So failure is not passed on. This is not the case with the human species. We are able to actually learn from failure, right? Because, I guess very plainly, failure does not entail death for our species, or at least at this point, it doesn't, right? So when we talk about things that are in moments in thought and in philosophy, things that are wrong, we can learn from them, and it recalls of what Hegel says, where right, the false is a moment of the true, right? And so the value of critical insight is that it takes in the false, it recognizes the false, right, as that which determines the truth. It's a moment of the truth. And in so doing, it's able to become truer, right? It has, truth kind of contains within its development, these moments. And, looking in the scheme of things, we see that some of the moments that are contained within truth are false, but they're nonetheless very instrumental to it. So I think there's a kind of notion in this of, well, really the kind of the argument that's working here is that something that separates man and animal is critical reflection from failure specifically versus just well, we need to be able to revise things. It's like, well, we need to be able to notice our wrong turns in thought as moments within a larger body of truth. And if we say right now to affirm ourselves to dogma, what we are saying is that we have the full body of truth, right? What that is in effect what we are saying, that we don't need, right? We have what is true now. And not only is that just uncritical in the sense that, well, you're not thinking about it. It's not learning from, it's not taking into account the fullness of truth, which continues as, people come to exist, right? Truth changes in that sense, right? Another Hegelism is that, right, truth and falsity are not things that are just set up in opposition to each other, the one on one side and one on the other, right? nor is truth a minted coin that you can just put in your pocket, right? It's not something that is possessible in some sense that we can just put away. There's a dynamism to it. And while Kant is obviously not really elaborating on that, I do think there is a kernel of a kind of dynamism of truth to it, which is why he says, maybe that is an explanation when I thought, okay, sacred right of mankind, my right to think freely, bro. When we think of the sacred right of mankind, it really is this idea of what makes it a right of mankind is that, well, animals, they don't function like this. Plants don't function like this. They're not able to see the plant that grows improperly dies. So other plants aren't able to see the dead plant as a moment of truth for plant life. But in the history of thought, when we look at incorrect religious dogma, we can recognize, right? Okay, even in Christianity, if you look at something like Arianism, right, which is regarded to be false now, right? We recognize Arianism, in the span of its moments in the development of Christian doctrine. We recognize where it comes from, what function it had, right? What its development represents to us. So we have a deeper understanding of it.
Yeah.
And it's not something that's static. So I think there is the idea that truth is not a static thing. And to have infallible dogma would be to treat it like it's static. So that's kind of
I
the,
think
the
you're right.
full
I
extent of
think
my
you're right.
thoughts. Yeah.
Truth is not static. To stick with the plant life analogy here, when a plant withers and dies, it nourishes the soil, um, for other plants to grow. And so, in very much the same way, you bring up this example of early heresies like Arianism. Um, these different strains that kind of grew and withered and died were the occasion for the explication of the belief, the elaboration of the belief, in a kind of fuller way, um, albeit it takes a form of a defense against heresies. Um, but I think you're right in a certain sense. Um, Again, it's a great line, falsity being a moment of truth, right? That all human knowledge, when viewed like this, is so again, like a dogma is not necessarily rejected so much as it is made to nourish the soil upon which truth can grow. Um, yeah, I think that's I don't know if it's probably it's not I wouldn't say it's utopian, but it's an optimistic way of looking at human knowledge, right? Um, Again, very much in line with Hegel, we're giving a reason to the history of human thought, of knowledge, right?
Yeah. I think that's a very we might say that's a kind of liberal characteristic in some sense, right? Or it's an enlightenment characteristic. Um, Whereas if the Dark Ages were uncertainty, enlightenment is a sense of direction of where we're going, or at least the idea that we could be going somewhere, which is optimism.
Yeah.
And that, the idea that we could be going somewhere, I think is a very liberal idea. Um, in the sense of, well, it's not progress for the sake of progress or progress for itself, but we're recognizing a hitherto unknown freedom, right? And that is achievable. And we know it's achievable because, of our advancements, humanity's come so far, right? Well, if we look upon the history of development, um, are we to look at it in terms of where we, like, well, this is just the way things or are we to look at it as kind of like Hegel would say, moments that are, kind of on a progression, a dynamic progression of truth going somewhere. And I think you could say that's maybe a delineating feature in when Kant is pointing out in his retrospective of what is enlightenment. Perhaps in retrospective, enlightenment is the beginning of mankind becoming conscious of the idea that we could go somewhere, which is deeply tied into liberalism, which is there's a better society is possible, or something, kind of very indeterminate notion in this.
Um, I might be breaking the rules here a little bit, but I'm gonna refer to a different text from Kant. Um, the idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, in which he says, and kind of along the lines of what we're talking about here now, quote, everyone can see that philosophy can have her belief in a millennium, but her millenarianism is not utopian, since the idea can help, though only from afar, to bring the millennium to pass. And so the basic bourgeois Enlightenment insight here is that we could be going somewhere, um, which is already a very different view of existence than was preponderant in earlier stages of human civilization, right? Where people did not think what is possible today would be possible. Um, the recognition of kind of this vast array of possibilities which exist is kind of the driving factor of bourgeois society. And it's not utopian. It's kind of it's a real kind of millenarianism.
Yeah, and it's, to bring back, the public and private reason, it's a kind of the kind of development that we might say is driven in accordance with the individual, with not just the individual, but with the free individual, right? The person who is determining themselves, and in their self-determination, right? They are, you know, coming to recognize where they've come from, and if they can determine themselves, there's a notion of where they're going, right? So you can see that that's the individual plays, and that's why, right? The scholar using his reason, he's using his reason freely because he's able to discern about himself, right? He's not there's the chain of being is gone, and so there's a direction left for the person to assess where they're going, and precisely because the individual is left to do this is how, as Kant says, it might come about, right? The idea from a distance to bring the age about. So you get that's a very maybe a very good insight into a kind of underlying kernel to liberal thought, right? Of in recognizing the ideal, the individual kind of can bring it about, right? Even if it's only from a distance. But
Yeah, it is the basic fact that individuals in concert, again, like I said earlier, constitute their own mode of existence, that we are always producing our mode of existence. We do this together as individuals. And so it is in this way that we bring the millennium to pass in a certain sense, without, trying to say that we're not like trying to divine what this millennium is or
right.
something. It is not a theological exercise, I would say. But yeah,
No.
um, it's something that's happening in our activities. Do we want to, is there another section of the
Um,
text as you see it, or do we just want
yeah,
to
well, I just,
wrap up?
obviously we kind of talked about the monarch there. I did want to say, or I wanted to get your notion right on the enlightened age versus in age of enlightenment.
Mm.
And he says, right, it seems at first he says, well, the idea is that we still have a long way to go before men as a whole can be in the position of using their own understanding confidently and well in religious matters. And really, this discourse on religion, he will say later, it's because he thinks immaturity in religious thought is a particularly growing concern at his time, and it's particularly egregious because it's very important. So his kind of critique of institutional religion, I think, is topical more than anything. But the idea of an enlightened age, um, I thought about Kant is saying, we have a ways to go before there's the enlightened age. And an enlightened age presumably would be an area where as he says, people are confident in using their own understanding. So I think, um, is this attainable, right? Maybe, is this a possible world? Or is enlightenment a kind of continuing process? But even if we were to read it like that, Kant says that there's a definite age to it, right? That they are in the time of enlightenment and we are not. And so it recalls a gap between then and now, right? If Kant seems to think that the age of enlightenment is really, it is a period and it's defined by something. Um, do we, so are we in the enlightened age now, right? Or do we still see dogmatism? Maybe perhaps the same dogmatism that Kant sees in religious institutions or in scientific institutions, right? Where we talk about the textbook, right? If everything you need to know is in the textbook, it is a kind of dogmatism, which Hegel notes, around, I guess, 30 or 40 years later. But it calls to mind for me the gap between, right? If Kant says we are living in the age of enlightenment, and he seems to think that that's a specific time, is this right? As now is 2023 an enlightened age? And if so, like, why not?
Wait, if it is an enlightened age, why not?
Or I'm
I
sorry,
didn't.
if it isn't, why not?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Um, I don't know. I would raise an eyebrow to the suggestion that we've attained to the enlightened society that Kant was aiming at.
Right.
Um, this would be news to me, if this really were the case. Um,
But perhaps this is what like people want us to think, right? In some sense,
sure.
you point out the Bill Kristol quoting Kant, right? If you
Yeah.
were to ask many of today's liberals, right, the people who are in the liberal tradition, kind of post 50s and 60s, if you were to say, do we live in an enlightened age?
Hmm.
Maybe some of them would say yes, right?
And others might still say yes and say that this is precisely the cause for rejecting the Enlightenment, that this is somehow a very pitiful kind of existence that is nevertheless an enlightened age. Certainly, I think in the conservative realm of things, people might say that. So, um, I had a thought and vanished for a second. Um, yeah, I don't know. Um, I think enlightenment, it would be very strange to, like I said earlier, to even suggest that there could be some such a thing as an enlightened age. Um, this would almost be the millennium that
Yeah.
just referred to in the previous quote. So, has this millennium come to pass? Well, we're in a new millennium. So, ding, ding, ding. Now, um,
It seems like though, Kant wants to set up the idea that the Enlightenment is a definite age, right? Because I think on one, I was tempted when I first read this to think, well, Enlightenment's a kind of process. And really, maybe the business of Enlightenment is a process, right? What the Enlightenment is doing is a process, namely the process of critical thought, of society reflecting itself. But
okay.
the Enlightenment, capital E Enlightenment as a period, seems to be a definite time, which is why, as you noted earlier, he says, in this respect, our age is the age of enlightenment, the century of Frederick. Particularly to note, he
Okay.
identifies it with a specific time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Um, sure. Which would then suggest that, well, what succeeds the age of enlightenment? The enlightened age.
right.
So the century after Frederick's would presumably be when we're all enlightened. However, maybe so. Okay, there's perhaps two ways of this being regarded, two ways in which this could be seen as uncritical. There is a certain reading of this, which maybe it is the neoconservative reading of people like Bill Kristol, which um which regards the present as the enlightened age, in the sense that it's a it's an apologetic for the status quo, that what exists is enlightened. This would in effect be the same kind of dogma which Kant rejects earlier on, right? For the present, to claim the status of enlightened would be to claim a lease on the future so that the future could not pretend to have attained higher enlightenment than us if we are enlightened. Um, Perhaps we are enlightened in the present in such, perhaps really what it means to be enlightened in the present is again just to be in a moment of a process of enlightenment. But then again, this could also turn into an apologetic for simply what exists, for the status quo, by suggesting that whatever exists in the moment of the present is enlightened
Right.
by virtue of the fact of being in the present. We are in a process of enlightenment. Um, the present is the highest stage hitherto in this process. But that also would seem wrong because it seems like it's possible for us to become disenlightened. So
Well, I
either
mean,
way, yeah, go ahead.
I think he said, well, he says that later in the clause, he says, right, the enlightened age is um, where he says men as a whole can be in position or can be even put into a position of using their own understanding confidently and well in religious matters without outside guidance. Seems like this, I don't know. It seems to me like he's saying that this is a state, that there's a state in which people might do this. And under this description, um, you know, perhaps people might say now we are in an enlightened age, but I think you could argue persuasively against that, that we are maybe more hemmed in by the guardians than ever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the guardians can be actual institutional authorities, or they can be the methods by which we understand now, like textbooks, or just, you could look at the internet, right? It's just a wealth of knowledge that is so on display. People, boomers point this out. Well, there's just so much knowledge on display, but the real insight, yeah, there is a lot of knowledge, and there's a lot of insight into whether this is true or false. But there is no the table of contents, so to speak, that the internet presents is just that, right? It's a table of contents, right? It's not an explication of kind of the dynamic process by which was engaged in to arrive at where we are now, where we have this tons of knowledge, right? um, Hegel used another thing where it's like, imagine all the baskets of food that are in a grocer's shop. They're all nicely categorized, right? And you can go through and you can pick out whatever you like, right? But is this an apt description of what knowledge is, or what it means to know? You're simply just a shopper who's picking out things from the grocer's categorized bins? Or does being a knower really mean something more of really kind of an interaction with the truth rather than truth as a la carte to you? So I think, in that sense, maybe the enlightened age is not here, right? And so if the enlightened age is not here, if we're more hemmed in by the guardians, right, then maybe we were even in Kant's time. Um, what is this? For me, I guess it raises what does this say about the notion of progress then, right? Is the 20th century, is the 19th or 20th century just a tremendously long kind of melee in the way that, for Kant, it seems like things are developing so rapidly. In 1784, in just 5 years, you're going to get the French Revolution, of which Kant was highly supportive of. Things were moving very fast. And then after that, you have Napoleon, who's going to completely reshape Europe. And now, right, what's the phrase of, the people, nothing happens, right? I don't know. Maybe, contrary to are we in an enlightened age, the question perhaps might be, are we even in an age of enlightenment where people are conscious of this? And what does that say about if we come from the society of Kant, right? If this is the Kantian society, um, how can it be so profoundly unlike that which he imagined or even was experiencing himself?
Yeah, which again, it's so paradoxical precisely because some of the things he's saying here have become so ubiquitous, right? But it seems farcical, it seems insincere, however else we might put it. Um, just adding on to your point about the internet being a table of contents. Um, I think there's a Schopenhauer quote where he says, people confuse acquiring a book with acquiring the knowledge contained in it. That seems to pretty aptly describe how we look at the internet. Certainly, it doesn't seem like the boomers are poring over every book available on LibGen or what have you. Um, it's just kind of there. Um, which I guess, what else can be said about that other than that it's unfortunate? I don't have anything else to say about that right now, but um, I think you pose the right question. Are we even in an age of enlightenment? Right? There's a lot of people who might want to claim that we live in an enlightened age. Again, calls to mind the neoconservatives and Francis Fukuyama and the end of history crowd. But have we reverted to some kind of prehistory? I don't know. It's a lot of different ways that one could cast that question.
But only a ruler who is himself enlightened and has no fear of phantoms, yet who likewise has at hand a well-disciplined and numerous army to guarantee public security, may say what no republic would dare to say. Argue as much as you like and about whatever you like, but obey. This reveals us a strange and unexpected pattern in human affairs, such as we shall always find if we consider them in the widest sense, in which nearly everything is paradoxical. A high degree of civil freedom seems advantageous to a people's intellectual freedom, yet it also sets up insuperable barriers to it. Conversely, a lesser degree of civil freedom gives intellectual freedom enough room to expand to its fullest extent. Thus, once the germ of on which nature has lavished most care, man's inclination and vocation to think freely, has developed within this hard shell, it gradually reacts upon the mentality of the people, who thus gradually become increasingly able to act freely. Eventually, it even influences the principles of governments, which find that they can themselves profit by treating man, who is more than a machine, in a manner appropriate to his dignity. Obviously, here we get the idea of this, this letter is written with the background of Frederick in mind. Frederick, the enlightened monarch, and I guess Frederick has a reputation in history of being relatively tolerant. And so I think, the general notion is that it once again relies on this incredible distinction, and incredible in the sense that it's doing a lot, of the public and private life, right? There's the private reason and then public reason, or we might say an individual using his reason, playing the role of scholar, versus the individual who is playing a role in accordance with the functioning of society and its government or something like this. And so, for Kant, the enlightened monarch might be simply someone who recognizes this and who recognizes this distinction as beneficial, that people who are enlightened, right, they're able to make things better just simply by correcting what was false knowledge, right? Maybe something as simple as that. But at the same time, they're cognizant of their obligations in their societal roles. And my biggest thing here was the paradox of freedom that Kant points out. And this is, I think, really the ultimate point of what this essay was trying to get at, which I raised earlier, of how does the Enlightenment balance with its institutions, right? With the institutions that it's having an effect upon. And Kant, once again, really puzzlingly concludes that a high degree of civil freedom, it seems to be advantageous, but it's not. It sets up barriers. And, why is this the case? Because, we might say that allowing a high degree of civil freedom would mean that there's the possibility of severely undermining the state. Recalling back his example of the police officer who questions his orders, right, while he is receiving them. This is obviously, something that can't happen to have a well-functioning police force. You can't have people kind of critiquing their orders as when they need to perform a job. And so I read the high degree of civil freedom kind of in this light, where it's, well, you're setting up barriers to enlightenment because you're undermining the kind of intelligible framework by which people are able to become enlightened or are able to reason publicly, which is a secure state, right? That's why he says guaranteeing public security. Only once this is, public security is kind of guaranteed, it's almost antecedent to being able to reason or to argue and these kinds of things. So high degree of civil freedom is maybe Kant wishes to associate that with some form of anarchy, where people are allowed to say whatever they want, irrespective of their social functions within their social function, right? Like the teacher is able to undermine what they are supposed to teach, or the police officer questions his orders, or the citizen may not pay his taxes. And that's not enlightenment. That's in a sense disenlightenment, because it's people not recognizing the kind of significant backgrounds of which the enlightenment must take place in, namely their role in society. I think, this is maybe a very Aristotelian reading of it, but I think it makes sense, right? It's not progressing to allow people to say, whatever for the sake of, well, you can do whatever, right? If the state is prior to man, then the state is an intelligible background for man to perform his reasoning functions, to use his reason at all. So to undermine that via excessive civil freedom, if you could call it that, would be to not properly allow for enlightenment. And so then he points out, well, lesser civil freedom, what does it do? It sets what he calls a hard shell of which thinking can take place. And I think of the hard shell in the sense of, people are just, kind of cognizant of the bounds of which, the bounds of their critique, where, hey, your use of reason doesn't mean undermining the society which permits you to do this, right? Which you might say is very liberal, right? This recalls, Karl Popper and the paradox of tolerance, right? And I think maybe that is what Kant is getting at here. Maybe this is a very early prefigurement of the paradox of tolerance, and that's why he calls it a paradox, because we allow people to undermine society. There won't be a society by which we can think, and the state is prior to a person's ability to use their reason. So in that sense, setting a hard shell allows thought to inhabit this shell, to inhabit its proper space, and then to kind of affect that which is beyond, right? Maybe it promotes a virtuous living, as he would say, act freely. And to act freely is to act morally for Kant. That's his, kind of equivocation that's going on there. So when people recognize the laws of the state as fundamental to their moral action, and their reasoning thus is kind of within that sphere, it's able to affect, change in governments and that kind of thing. But that's basically my take. That's pretty long-winded, but yeah, if you wanted to.
Well, I think you said it there at the end, which is that, okay. So if we go back to the beginning of the essay and we accept what Kant is saying about freedom being freedom of thought, freedom of action being almost the natural condition of man, being natural, and then unnatural restrictions arising in the course of time, right? It is in this regime of perhaps unnatural restrictions in which freedom, a greater freedom, arises, is made possible. So it's paradoxical because freedom is able to emerge on the basis of unfreedom. This goes for freedom of thought as much as it goes for civil freedom, right? the freedom of thought, well, what precedes it, it succeeds dogmatism, right? Unfreedom of thought. So it occurs on the basis of unfreedom and subsequently reacts back on those fetters on freedom, right? So an enlightened people, right? He says the mentality of the people, which these people thereby gradually become capable of freedom in acting, right? This then reacts back on the principles of government, which adjust in due course, right? So that's what I got from it, which is that, the state is the state is not a dogma, right?
Yeah.
Its existence in the present is not dogmatic. It doesn't have kind of lease on the future, right? If it is capable of facilitating a situation in which people are engaged in enlightenment, in which people become increasingly enlightened, right? Then that reacts back on the state, and the state changes accordingly. Um, it is in this way that these state institutions mediate enlightenment.
Yeah.
And the point of enlightenment, in part, is to be able to regulate the principles of government. And this is why you want, I guess, an enlightened guardian in this language, right? Who is capable of regulating the principles of government in this way that is conducive towards the enlightenment of the people. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting I actually, I think that reading is probably pretty good because I might be Aristotle washing Kant in some way. With the state prior to the individual. Certainly, I do know Kant says in the philosophy of right that the state, right, submitting yourself to the law of the state is a form of submitting yourself to the universal law of acting morally. But I think what I like about your comments is that and what I don't think maybe I didn't pick up on enough is the importance of the state is subject to reason. The state is subject to right reason. And reason is ultimately right following, what is in accordance with right is ultimately what is more important than following in, kind of in accordance with the state. And that is in kind of then now looking at this essay as a whole, that is it's that's a very liberal quality, right? In the sense of kind of subjecting the state to our rational reflections about the state and making sure that our reasonings about what is right take precedent in matters of state. And they must take precedent in matters of state in order to continue this process of enlightenment. And so when we look at, as looking back, we're talking about the problems when Kant is saying, how is the Enlightenment dealing with the institutions which it surrounds? It seems Kant really wants to emphasize a kind of a critical role that it plays, right? Which is the function of enlightenment is to critique these various institutions, in order to bring them within accordance with right reason, right? So the Enlightenment at one point, it's it's a product of its time, right? It's within the container, the hard shell of the state, right? But at the same time, it's it's externalizing itself. It's acting upon the spheres of public life, and it must. And we see, right, Kant very much. I think the idea of an enlightened guardian, you say, is meant to prevent the cannibalization of the Enlightenment upon itself, right? Because if you imagine, Kant doesn't say that we need a guardian of an enlightened public, then we run into what he says is kind of a paradox of freedom, of a high degree of civil freedom. Well, it instead promotes undermining institutions which are supposed to be good for us, right? And in placing Kant where he is, right, and recognizing who will come after him, This is an insight that is seized upon by a political insight that's seized upon by people who follow Kant, right? Of, well, the state is ultimately kind of subject to reason, and the Enlightenment has brought about the subjugation of the state to reason in accordance with the universal law. This is something Hegel is gonna take up and point out the problems with this view, which, of course, we can't discuss here, but nonetheless, I think we can look at Kant of saying, well, yeah, the Enlightenment is it's totalizing in its effects on society, and the program of the Enlightenment seems to entail um, a specific kind of state, even if not a specific kind of government, a kind of state, namely that state in which right reason reigns supreme, right? And this is where we might say is a very clear line between the liberal thought of Kant then and maybe the modern liberal thought now. And I'm particularly thinking of people like John Rawls. Rawls, a thinker of the liberal age, which is the idea that the principles of justice of society are those principles which are reached by a kind of rational reflection. And so, in that sense, we might say that project of subjecting the state to reason is something that's going to kind of continually be brought up in the Enlightenment, the liberals. I mean, I think we can maybe trace everyone, even in Leviathan, right? Hobbes is very clear that in subjecting the state to reason, in the sense of, well, ultimately this must exist, in accordance with how humanity works, right? The state must take into account this kind of right reason of the working of humanity before it is able to actually succeed in its functions. But there's a certain priority of rationality, of rationalizing the state that is taking place that we might say is a distinct feature of the Enlightenment and a distinct feature of liberal society, one that wants to continue today. There is, it's like the moral high ground is a very popular, or it's a place where people want to be, right? So in modern society, people moralizing is very powerful, precisely because we recognize the idea. We come from the time where, well, the Enlightened Age is the age in where reason should take precedence. And if that's the case, well, we're in the Enlightened Age now. We need to do things in accordance with this kind of reason. We are left then to think, right? Is this really what happens? And I suppose that's a separate discussion. But despite the case, we do see at least some line of Kant that's traceable to now, right? At least some line. But whether it's, as Marx say, first as tragedy, then as farce, whether that is a farcical characteristic of modern society, we don't know. But nonetheless, I think, in Kant, that's a problem that he's taking up that is still very much a problem today.
And yeah, well said. Very well said. I'll only add again, I think your point about Hobbes and Leviathan is very apt. We raised at the very beginning the question, you know, uh, are we a product of the Enlightenment? To what extent can we say that that is the case? Um, even people who today might try to ponder a monarchical system of government, who might go online and write up apologetics for monarchism. Those people too, although what they're advocating is a return to a pre-Enlightenment form of government in many ways, they're engaged in the same Enlightenment process of rationalization and subjecting government, the principles of government, to reasoned argumentation. So we are all, in that sense, the children of the Enlightenment, whether we like it or not. And that goes for, I guess, the monarchist LARPers.